I've spent most of my adult life working as a security guard. It's not glamorous, but it keeps the lights on. I've worked at gas stations, convenience stores, and small shops. Quiet places where you mostly sit, watch, and wait for nothing to happen. So, when I saw a job ad for a night shift at the local mall, I thought I'd finally found something better. The pay was the best I'd seen in years, and the hours weren't bad. 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. One building, quiet and easy. Or so I thought. How hard could it be? I could already picture myself in the security office, sipping coffee, and watching the grainy feeds from the cameras while wandering the hushed, cavernous halls of a sleeping mall. I applied right away and was surprised to get a call the very next day. The manager, Mr. Hensley, sounded in a rush as he asked if I could come in for an interview that afternoon. It felt sudden, but I wasn't about to question it. I needed the job, and the mall was close enough that I didn't even have to think about it. Driving over, a sense of unease crept over me. Was the mall that desperate for a night guard? The thought lingered, but I pushed it away. The interview was quick, almost too quick. Hensley asked about my experience but didn't seem interested in my answers. He rattled off the basics. Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, do hourly patrols. Nothing unusual. At the end, he looked at me and asked, "Can you start tonight?" That threw me. Most places want time for paperwork or a background check, but Hensley seemed in a hurry. "Sure," I replied, trying not to sound too eager. He nodded, relieved. "Great, we're short on staff," he said, rubbing his temples like the day's weight was crushing him. "The last few guards didn't last. I hope you'll be different." That comment made my stomach twist. What did he mean? But before I could ask, he handed me a key to the security office and told me to report at 11 p.m. sharp. I left, heading home to grab a few hours of sleep, but Hensley's words kept buzzing in my head. When I arrived at the mall, it was eerily deserted. The parking lot, so crowded during the day, was now an ocean of shadows under dim, flickering lights. A few scattered cars sat, lonely and isolated, under the vast canopy of night. The size and silence of the place made it feel like a sleeping giant, and for a moment I thought about turning around. Something didn't feel right. I shook it off as nerves and walked up to the employee entrance. Mr. Hensley met me there, leading me through the dim corridors to the security office. He ran through the protocols again as we walked, but his voice was distracted like he was thinking about something else. The office was small, claustrophobic even, with a wall of monitors displaying grainy feeds from cameras around the building. "Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, he repeated. "Do your rounds, make sure nothing's out of place, and keep an eye on the escalators and the play area. Things happen there sometimes." "Things happen?" I asked, frowning. He waved his hand dismissively. "Kids trying to sneak in after hours. You'll see." I nodded, though a shiver ran down my spine. His tone wasn't casual. He handed me a printed sheet of standard instructions, shook my hand, and said, "Good luck. I'll see you in the morning." Once he left, the quiet of the mall wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I sat in front of the monitors, flipping through the feeds. The escalators were motionless, the stores were dark and empty. It seemed almost peaceful. For a few minutes, I let myself relax. Then, I felt it. An unmistakable presence behind me. My heart jumped into my throat as I turned to see a janitor standing there, a grin on his face. "Didn't mean to scare you, buddy," he said with a chuckle. "You must be the new guy." I let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, that's me. I didn't know there was a janitor here at night." "There's always one of us around," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Make sure everything's ready for the next day. But listen, follow the rules." "The rules?" I asked, confused. "You mean the instructions?" He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, handing it to me with a grave look. "These aren't from the manager. These are the real rules. If you want to make it through the night, follow them." I unfolded the paper, expecting a joke, but the list was anything but funny. Rules to keep you safe. 1. Check the security cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but don't stare at the footage for too long. 2. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If the mannequins change position, leave the area immediately. My stomach tightened. "You're serious?" The grin vanished from his face. "I'm warning you. Follow the rules or you'll end up like the last guy." I laughed nervously, stuffing the paper into my pocket. Well, I'm off to make my first round. The janitor stepped aside, watching me with a look that stayed with me as I walked away. Something about him felt wrong, like he was genuinely afraid. I shrugged it off, not wanting to let some weird list mess with my head. The mall at night was different and unsettling. The dim lights cast long shadows, and every sound echoed in the silence. As I walked past darkened stores, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The play area was deserted, its colorful plastic structures looking oddly lifeless under the emergency lights. I kept moving, trying to focus on the routine until I reached the escalators. Everything seemed fine until I noticed one of the clothing stores had its door slightly ajar. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating racks of clothes. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but as I swept the beam across the store, I saw movement. Just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I turned back, and there they were, mannequins lined up in eerie silence. My heart pounded as I realized one had definitely shifted its position. I swallowed hard, remembering the rules. Don't look directly at the mannequins, but how could I not? They were right there, lifeless, yet somehow watching. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is this some kind of joke?" Silence. The mannequins remained still, but the atmosphere felt heavier. I backed away, my pulse racing, and continued my rounds, refusing to look back. As the night wore on, the silence became oppressive. I kept glancing at the monitors, the mannequins untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. I thought about the janitor's rules, about his warning. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but tonight, something felt different. Near the end of my shift, I sat in the office, exhausted but unable to rest. The monitors flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure in the play area, a shadow just standing there. My heart raced. I blinked, and it was gone. But the unease remained. The night dragged on, filled with echoes and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made me second-guess my sanity. When morning finally came, I felt like I had survived something more than just a shift. I had survived something I didn't understand. As I left the mall, the janitor's words echoed in my mind. Follow the rules. I knew I'd be back the next night, but part of me didn't want to return. Something about that place wasn't right, and deep down, I knew I wasn't the only one keeping watch. "Help, please. Someone." The voice drifted through the trees, chilling and desperate. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced eerily around me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, as the sound echoed again, closer this time. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a summons. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew. Whatever was calling out to me wasn't human. The sun had disappeared, leaving the forest cloaked in darkness. I was alone on the familiar trail, but tonight it felt different. The peaceful rustling of leaves and the distant hoots of owls were overshadowed by an unsettling silence. Every step I took seemed louder than it should, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots echoing unnaturally. Then I heard it again, a faint, trembling voice. "Help!" I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was so faint, so fragile, but it tugged at something deep within me. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. The forest swallowed my words, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But then, another cry pierced the stillness, louder and more urgent. It was coming from deeper in the woods, off the well-worn path. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its beam flickering uncertainly, as if mirroring my own doubt. The trail was safe, familiar, but the pull of that voice was irresistible. Taking a deep breath, I stepped off the path, pushing through the underbrush toward the sound. The further I ventured, the thicker the forest became. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, and the air grew colder with each step. The cries continued, leading me deeper into the darkness. But something about them didn't feel right. They were too perfect, too consistent, as if someone or something was mimicking a human plea. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the voice kept calling, drawing me closer. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a clearing. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on an old, decrepit cabin. The cries were louder now, coming from inside. The cabin looked abandoned, its wooden frame sagging with age. The windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but the cries of help left me no choice. "Hello?" I called out, stepping cautiously toward the cabin. My voice barely broke the oppressive silence. "Is someone in there?" The door creaked open wider, as if inviting me in. My heart pounded as I crossed the threshold, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the interior. The cabin was a wreck. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and thick layers of dust covered every surface. But then I saw it. A spiral staircase leading down into darkness. The cries were coming from below. "Please help." The voice was clearer now, almost childlike. It pulled at my heartstrings, overriding my fear. I descended the stairs, each creaking step echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder, and a musty, damp smell filled my nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood an old tape recorder, its reels spinning. The cries played on a loop, growing louder and more desperate. I stared in disbelief. "What the hell?" Before I could move, the recorder stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart racing. I rushed up the stairs, pounding on the door. "Let me out, please!" No answer. Only the oppressive silence of the basement. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen showed nothing. No bars, no service. Desperation took hold. I had to find another way out. My flashlight caught the outline of another door at the far end of the room. It was old, warped, and barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open and found myself in a narrow, dark tunnel. The walls were lined with roots and stone, and the air was thick with the scent of earth. There was no other option but to follow the tunnel, hoping it would lead me to safety. As I walked, the silence was deafening. My own footsteps echoed unnervingly, and every so often I thought I heard something behind me, soft, shuffling steps. But whenever I turned, there was nothing but darkness. The tunnel twisted and turned, seeming to go on forever. My flashlight's beam flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt like I was being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Then, in the distance, I saw a faint light. Relief surged through me, and I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the claustrophobic tunnel. But as I approached the light, my heart sank. It wasn't the exit. It was another room, identical to the one I had left behind. In the center, another tape recorder sat on a table, its reels spinning. "No," I whispered, backing away. The cries started again, louder, more insistent. "Help. Please. Someone." The door behind me slammed shut, trapping me once more. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing colder and more suffocating. I had no choice but to keep moving, hoping to find a way out. I pushed open another door at the far end of the room, leading into another tunnel. The pattern repeated. Tunnel, room, tape recorder, cries, slamming door. Each time, the cries grew more distorted, more inhuman. Time lost all meaning as I wandered through the endless maze. My flashlight's battery died, leaving me in total darkness. I stumbled blindly, guided only by the faint light of the rooms and the haunting cries. Finally, I emerged into the forest once more. The cool night air hit my face, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. But as I looked around, my heart sank. The cabin was gone, the tunnel entrance vanished. I was back on the trail, as if nothing had happened. Exhausted and terrified, I made my way home, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lured into something far beyond my understanding. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, a faint cry for help, echoing from the forest. This time I knew better. Whatever it wasn't human, and it was still out there waiting. I've always been a night owl, the kind who stays up reading, binging TV shows, or just scrolling mindlessly on my phone. So when I moved into that quiet little rental house on the edge of town, I figured it would be the perfect retreat. Peaceful. No noisy neighbors, no bustling city sounds. Just me, my books, and the occasional sound of crickets outside. The first few nights were exactly what I needed. peace and quiet, with the occasional wind rustling the trees. It was perfect. But everything changed on the fifth night. I was lounging on the couch, a cup of tea in hand, flipping through some late-night TV when I heard it. Knock. 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 At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, it was past midnight, and who would be knocking at this hour? I muted the TV and strained my ears. The house was silent again, save for the low hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Maybe it was nothing. I shrugged it off and turned the volume back up, but then a few minutes later it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time there was no mistaking it. It was deliberate, slow, and steady. My heart began to race. I wasn't expecting anyone, and honestly, I didn't know anyone in town well enough for a midnight visit. I got up slowly, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The front door was just a few steps away. As I approached, the knock came again, more insistent this time. Knock, knock, knock. I hesitated. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I peeked through the peephole, but the porch was empty. A chill ran down my spine. Could it have been kids playing pranks? But the street was quiet, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting. After a minute, I slowly turned the lock, opened the door just a crack, and peered outside. The porch was empty. The only thing that greeted me was the cold night air. I closed the door, double-locked it, and went back to the couch. Trying to shake off the unease, I chalked it up to nerves or maybe even the wind knocking something against the house. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. The next day passed without incident. Work kept me busy, and by evening, I had almost forgotten about the strange knocking. Almost. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the unease crept back in. I found myself glancing at the door more often, anticipating the sound. And sure enough, just as the clock struck 12, it came. Knock. 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 This time I didn't move. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching a throw pillow to my chest, my eyes locked on the front door. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining for any sound beyond the knocks. Knock, knock, knock. It was the same as the night before. Slow, deliberate, and patient. I didn't bother calling out this time. Instead, I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed my friend Jess. She picked up groggily on the third ring. "Hey, what's up? It's late," she mumbled. "Jess, someone's knocking at my door," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's past midnight and there's no one there." "What? Are you sure? Maybe it's just the wind or something." "It's not the wind. It's deliberate, like someone's really there." She was silent for a moment. "Do you want me to come over?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, if you can. Please. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Just stay put, okay?" I hung up, feeling a little more grounded knowing she was on her way. The knocking had stopped again, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I didn't dare look out the window this time. When Jess arrived, she knocked. 3 quick raps, familiar and comforting. I practically yanked the door open, letting her in. "Okay," she said, her eyes wide. "What's going on?" I explained everything, from the knocking the night before to the eerie silence that followed each time. Jess, being the practical one, walked around the house, checking windows and doors. "Nothing out of place," she reported. "But it's weird, I'll give you that." We decided to camp out in the living room for the night. Jess on the couch, me on the armchair, both of us determined to see this through together. Midnight came and went. No knocking, no strange noises. By 1 a.m., Jess was snoring softly, and I felt foolish for dragging her out here. But just as I was about to doze off, it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. I shot upright, my heart leaping into my throat. Jess stirred, groggy but alert. "Was that?" I nodded, pointing at the door. We both stared at it, neither of us daring to move. "Should we?" Jess whispered, but I shook my head. The knocking didn't come again. We stayed frozen, waiting, listening. And then we heard it. The faint sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. Jess reached for her phone. "I'm calling the cops." As she spoke with the dispatcher, I could hear the footsteps fade away, retreating into the night. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, but like before, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The officer, a tall man with a kind face, assured us they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night. But even with their reassurance, the unease didn't leave. The next few nights were quiet, and I began to hope that maybe whoever, or whatever, was behind the knocking had moved on. But the sense of dread lingered. I found myself jumping at small noises, keeping the lights on longer than usual. A week later, just as I was beginning to feel somewhat normal again, the knocking returned. This time it wasn't at midnight, it was 3 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. I sat bolt upright in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. I grabbed my phone, intending to call Jess, but stopped. This time, something felt different. The knocking was louder, more forceful, and then, for the first time, a voice. "Let me in." It was soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send chills down my spine. I didn't respond, didn't dare move. The voice came again, more insistent. "Let me in." I clutched the phone, my fingers trembling. The police had found nothing before, but this was different. Someone was speaking, and they were right outside my door. I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. The operator stayed on the line, her calm voice a lifeline in the dark. She promised help was on the way, but as I waited, the knocking continued, louder and faster now, accompanied by that chilling whisper. "Let me in." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on me. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. When the police arrived, they found nothing once again. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no clues. It was as if the visitor had vanished into thin air. I didn't stay in that house long after that night. I packed my things and moved in with Jess temporarily, unable to shake the fear that had taken root in my heart. To this day, I don't know who or what was knocking at my door. But I do know one thing. If you ever hear a knock after midnight, don't answer it. When I first heard about the cabin, it was through an old family story, one of those tales told late at night to keep kids entertained or scared. My uncle would always bring it up around the campfire, his voice dropping to a whisper as he described the isolated cabin deep in the woods. He said it had been in our family for generations, but no one stayed there anymore. Too many strange things had happened, and it was better left alone. I thought it was all just a spooky story meant to thrill kids, nothing more. But a few years later, after the hustle of city life started to wear me down, I remembered that cabin. A place to disconnect sounded perfect, even if it came with a few ghost stories. I decided to go. I wanted solitude, time to think, and maybe a little adventure. My uncle didn't try to stop me, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled with the idea. "It's your decision," he said, his eyes serious. "But remember, once you're out there, it's just you in the woods. Be careful." The drive out was long and winding. The further I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then finally to a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was setting, casting the cabin in a golden glow that should have been inviting, but felt ominous. The cabin was exactly as my uncle had described, weathered and worn, with a sagging roof and a porch that looked like it might collapse if I stepped on it too hard. The windows were covered in grime, and the door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside it was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and decay. I spent the first hour cleaning, sweeping away cobwebs and dusting off furniture. The cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchen, a stone fireplace, and a bed in the corner. It felt like stepping back in time. That first night was peaceful. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and I sat in an old armchair, sipping tea and reading a book I'd brought. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves outside. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years, and when I finally went to bed, I slept deeply. But everything changed on the second night. I was sitting by the fire again, lost in my book, when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling flames. I frowned, thinking it must be the wind or a branch tapping against the wood. But then it came again, louder this time, deliberate. I put my book down and stood, heart pounding as I approached the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Who could be out here, in the middle of nowhere? With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. Nothing. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air prickling my skin. The moon cast long shadows across the clearing, but there was no sign of anyone. I closed the door, locking it behind me. Back by the fire, I tried to shake off the unease. It had to be the wind. I picked up my book, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside set my nerves on edge. I finally gave up and went to bed, hoping sleep would bring peace. But the knocking returned. It was louder, more insistent, waking me from a restless sleep. I sat up, my heart racing. This time it wasn't just at the door, it was at the windows, the walls, even the floor beneath me. It was everywhere, surrounding me. Panic set in. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and shone it around the room. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. I was alone, but the cabin felt different, darker somehow. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to close my eyes. When the first light of day broke through the trees, I felt a small sense of relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. On the third night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, I was haunted by something else. As I sat by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, I noticed the photographs on the mantel. They were old pictures of my family, black and white, their faces stern and serious. But something was off. The faces were blurred, distorted as if they'd been smeared by unseen hands. I picked up one of the frames, my fingers trembling. It was a photo of my grandparents, but their faces were unrecognizable, twisted into grotesque shapes. I dropped the frame, the glass shattering on the floor. Suddenly I felt it, a presence watching me from outside. I turned toward the window, and there it was. A shadow, darker than the night, standing just beyond the glass. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow didn't move, didn't waver. It just stood there, watching. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I whispered. No answer. The shadow remained. Gathering my courage, I moved toward the door. I had to get out, had to see who or what was out there. I pulled the door open, the cold night air rushing in. The shadow was gone, the clearing empty once more. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I hurried back inside, locking the door and bolting it for good measure. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat by the fire, the flashlight in my lap, jumping at every sound. The forest outside seemed alive, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. On the fourth night, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my things, ready to leave at first light. But as the sun set, the knocking returned. It was different now, more rhythmic, almost like a message. I ignored it, focusing on my escape plan. But the knocking grew louder, more urgent. It wasn't just at the door. It was all around me, echoing through the cabin. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. Then, the door burst open. Standing there was a figure cloaked in darkness, its face hidden. It stepped inside, its presence filling the room with an icy chill. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. I backed away, fear paralyzing me. The figure moved closer, its footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "Leave," it said, "before it's too late." I grabbed my bag and ran, not daring to look back. The forest closed in around me as I fled, the shadows whispering in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart pounding in my chest. I drove away, the cabin disappearing in the rearview mirror. Even now, miles away, I can still hear that knocking, echoing in my mind. And I know the cabin is still there, waiting for its last visitor.